Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's in good form. We're going to talk today about one of the coldest places on Earth. Tomorrow, you will see here in Pennsylvania, it will be very warm. So this will maybe chill you down a little bit, get you ready for this. So here is a scene that should never be done because this poor penguin is still in special therapy for this sound of the bagpipes down there. Anyway, what we're going to do today is explore a very interesting time in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. I'm going to be talking about these three gentlemen that are on the screen. On the right is Roald Amundsen, and then on his left, moving toward the left, is Robert Falcon Scott, and then Ernest Shackleton in a little tilted picture. And the reason is because Shackleton actually worked several of the missions, and it was very interesting to see him. And when we do the talk next week, we'll have probably one of the greatest adventures ever of endurance. So let's get moving here and see what we've got. These are the three players we're talking about today, Scott, Amundsen, and Shackleton. And this is a very interesting quote. I like this quote. It said, "For scientific leadership, give me Scott. For swift and efficient travel, Amundsen. But when you are in a hopeless situation, when there seems to be no way out, get on your knees and pray for Shackleton." And this was really the whole thread about these gentlemen and how they worked. Very well said by Raymond Priestley. Here is a look at the continent of Antarctica. It's huge, it's very cold, and for the most part, it's very high above sea level. Here's a map of the same area showing you the Transantarctic Mountains. And towards the upper left, about 11 o'clock, is the Antarctic Peninsula, which connects with the spine of the mountains that go through South America and all the way up through North America. So on the left is a picture of a satellite picture combination of Antarctica. And if we remove all the ice, you can see on the right that it's an archipelago of many islands and mountain ranges. We're going to be really focusing on the lower part, the Ross Sea area today in this talk. Next week when we do it, we'll be up in the Weddell Sea area. So those are the two areas we're going to really cover. Here is the United States superimposed over the continent. You can see how large it is, well over 3,000 miles across. A timeline of some of the explorers, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but to go back into the 1700s, you see that James Clark was one of the first explorers. They never really got close because their ships were incapable of pushing through ice, so they just went around it and stayed mainly in the liquid part of the ocean instead of the icy part. We're going to focus down here at the bottom from 1901 to 1910 today, those expeditions, which ran into a little bit longer, and you'll see what happens in this. But we're going to do the British National Antarctic Expedition, then the expedition of Ernest Shackleton, and then finally the race to the pole. So let's have a look at that. When we come back next Monday, we will do the British Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition by Ernest Shackleton. So a quote from Mr. Amundsen: "Victory awaits him who has everything in order. Luck, people call it. Defeat is certain for him who has neglected to take the necessary precautions in time. This is called bad luck." And this was a very pragmatic gentleman, an explorer of quite renown, who really did understand exploration. And that's a very good quote, because you'll see in another quote from another gentleman, not so much. Here is the Fram, that was a boat that was really owned by another explorer, Mr. Friedrich Nansen, and he loaned it to Amundsen, ostensibly to go and drift over the North Pole. That was the plan by Mr. Amundsen at this time. And here we are in Oslo at the Institute of History for the Polar Exploration. This is not the actual Fram. The Fram is in a museum inside. And here it is. This is the actual Fram, the ship that went down there. You may be able to notice in the lower middle picture the big reinforcement of the hull so it could push through ice. It had a very small rudder, as you can see, and a small propeller. And I don't know who that character up in the upper right is. So the next gentleman, Mr. Scott, Robert Falcon Scott, he says, our luck in weather is preposterous. How great may be the element of luck. Now you can see the difference in the two gentlemen, how they think. Here is Kathleen Bruce, Scott's wife. Kathleen was very influential in pushing him towards doing this. He really didn't want to do this. He wasn't that interested in it, but she saw the opportunity for him to become a very studied person and famous and all of that. So she kind of pushed him all the time towards doing this exploration. Here is the Discovery back in England. It's been redone and kept as a museum. It's a beautiful boat. And here is a look just to show you the Antarctic ice shelf that comes off the Ross Sea. This is huge in places, somewhere over 150 feet. You can see a ship next to it there. In some places it's a little lower, but this is a huge amount of ice floating on the water. And the difference in this diagram, you can see on the left side is what happens in the area around Greenland where the icebergs just calve off right from the edge of the higher elevations. But in Antarctica, you can see it forms an ice shelf that slides out hundreds and hundreds of miles, and then the icebergs calve off. A little bit different way it happens in both seas. And we're going to be studying today the Ross, the red one at the bottom, the Ross ice shelf. It's huge. It's bigger. It's as big as France, bigger than Texas. Let me put that over there so you can see it. Now, they knew that it was very important, these explorers, to document everything. And this was the beginnings of really good photography and movies. So this fellow, a Brit, Herbert Poynting, had the state-of-the-art photography equipment, and he did some fantastic work. And his work was really what got me interested in really studying the whole thing of the golden age of Antarctic exploration, because his detail on his photography and study of the area was just fantastic. I loved it. Here he is with a little horse cart pulled by doggies, having some fun with that. But you can see the equipment's kind of heavy, and yet he was able to make it work beautifully, even in the cold temperatures. That is Mount Erebus behind him, the volcano, active volcano. And here is a picture of him on the left, and then colorized, modern colorization to show you the difference, what we can do. While they were down there, they would go the year before they were going to do the expedition. They would get all settled in, build their fort, build their hut, and then they had to lay out depots so that the next year they could make the run. And over the winter, which was completely black, no light for about 4 months, the sun never rose, they would occupy themselves with various things. And this is one of them. This is a magazine that they wrote and illustrated, and beautifully done. Wonderful to have this in the archive so you can read about what they did and all the things they did to keep busy. They had this high-calorie, fatty diet that they thought would give them a lot of calories. It was basically ground meat, biscuits, sugar, butter, and hot tea or cocoa. That was their food for the whole time. Not a good mix, by the way. Here is the first hut down at the foot of the bay on the Ross Sea, called McMurdo Sound. And you can see that it was all prefabbed and put together pretty well. And this is today. It still exists over 120 years later. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. Here it is inside. You can see that there's some snow drifted in, but it's pretty much as it was when they left it. The people of New Zealand have taken charge of the huts, and they do just phenomenal work in keeping them as pristine as they can. You might be able to pick out in this picture, it's a little small, but over on the shelf is an open bottle of Heinz ketchup sitting there on the shelf. This is the experiment area for the various scientific explorations that they did. And this is it today. And I'm going to put an inset picture in here to show you what it was like when one of the scientists was working. It's the same area. That shelf, everything's the same. Nothing has changed. The hut and much of its contents were just completely covered in soot because they were burning seal blubber and penguin blubber to keep heat and also to cook their food. So everything got covered with soot, very greasy soot, They were too. They were covered with soot, and they couldn't bathe because it was so cold, and that would take a lot of energy to do that. Here is a very cute experiment they tried with a hydrogen-filled balloon to do a tethered look at the surrounding area by going up several hundred feet and looking around. It was first time that had ever been done in Antarctica. Here is a map of the island, the Ross Island as it's called, with the Ross Sea off on the left side, and you can see down as it comes down into McMurdo Bay, Scott's Base, the first one right at the bottom. The second one was Cape Evans, which is about halfway up, and then the last one was Cape Royds, and that was Shackleton's hut. And if you look all the way over to the right, you can see Cape Crozier is there. That is where they did an expedition during the dead of winter to pick up penguin eggs. Here's a little more detail on the area. Mount Erebus and Mount Terror are two volcanoes that are there. Mount Erebus is still active today. And here's a hand-drawn map that they did. So now we come to Ernest Shackleton, and his little quote was, "Difficulties are just things to overcome after all." And that was his philosophy, and it worked beautifully. The men loved him because he was a regular guy. He did not come from the Navy. He was a merchant marine, and he treated people equally. Everybody was equal. There was no upper deck and lower deck in his operation. Here he is as a young man. He was born in Ireland. His father was a farmer. They didn't do very well because of many things, including the potato famine. The doctor moved the family to England when Shackleton was a young lad, and the father became a doctor, and Shackleton went to college in London, near London. And here's some more maps of his explorations, and on the right, some stamps of Shackleton, various expeditions that he did. So here we are down in Antarctica, and we're going to do the three great voyages to Antarctica: the voyage of discovery by Robert Falcon Scott, the British Imperial Antarctic Expedition by Shackleton, and finally, we'll do the race to the pole, which was when Scott and Amundsen tried to get to the pole first. So the first one is the Voyage of Discovery, 1900 to 1904. This was the British National sponsored Antarctic expedition. You have Scott in the middle, Shackleton on the left, and his good buddy, Dr. Wilson, on the right. These were the three gentlemen that were going to try to walk to the South Pole, pulling a sledge loaded with food and tents and things like that. It was brutal work. So after they laid the depots the first year, now this is the second spring, Antarctic spring, because it's the seasons are reversed. Right now it's going into it's going into winter down there. We're going into summer. So they left, the three of them. You can see that they had pretty good clothing on. Wasn't as good as what the Norwegians did, but we'll talk about that. They made this attempt to walk to the South Pole. They covered over 700 miles in one direction, reached as far south as 82 degrees before being forced to turn back. Now, this was a landmark expedition, the Antarctic exploration of this continent. But when its return home was celebrated as a success, despite having needed a very expensive relief mission to free the Discovery from the ice. It was caught in the ice, and they had to bring another ship down to basically cut it out. And then later on, there were disputes about some of the quality of its scientific records. So it's a little iffy on what happened there. And the failure initially was to master the techniques of basically using skis and dogs, a legacy that persisted in the British Antarctic expeditions throughout the heroic age. Here's a map showing the three missions that the Discovery mission wanted to do. The black line from Hut Point out towards the left is an expedition to find the South Magnetic Pole. The blue line was the winter walk that they did to find the emperor penguin eggs. And then the red line going down towards the south is to go to the North Pole, the South Pole. These are the 3 expeditions that they tried to do. So on November 2nd, 1902, with some dogs and supporting parties, their goal was to get as far south as they could get. They really didn't understand how to use the dogs. They tried putting little leather covers on the dogs' feet, but the dogs then had very little traction because they needed their pads and their nails to get traction on the various surfaces. So that didn't work out too good. Their progress was slow. Here is Dr. Wilson's drawing. He was an artist. He was a really accomplished artist, and he would do these sketches. And if you could see on the right, as they're marching, he did some sketching, and he put in little notes for what colors there would be and the light and the texture and the snow and all the different things. And later on, he would paint pictures back at the base. So on November 15th, they started off on the 2nd. Scott's group began relaying their loads because the snow was so thick. They had all different kinds of snow, sticky snow, hummock snow, deep snow, and they couldn't pull this heavy sled. So what they would do is unload it somewhat, pull it forward, come back and get the other half. And for every mile, they would do 3 miles of walking. And it was just really back-breaking work. Here they are in a picture sitting down on the sledge. You can see the tent in the background. You can also see a little wheel on the right side of the picture. That was a mileage meter, so they could figure out how many miles they had gone. And some dogs sitting up there on the left of the picture. They had problems with the dog food. The dogs were growing weaker. Wilson had to kill a few of the dogs to feed the others. They were also getting snow blindness. They did not have sunglasses like we have today. So they made these handmade wooden goggles, basically, to keep some of the light down so they could see. And a thing called scurvy started to attack them because they were eating food that had no vitamins in it. Lots of calories, but no vitamins. On Christmas Day, Shackleton had hidden a Christmas pudding in his socks, and he brought that out, and they had some Christmas pudding and double rations and maybe a wee nip of some brandy. On the 30th of December, without having left the barrier, they reached their farthest south. You can see it at the X on the map. They got to 82 degrees, 17 minutes south. That was as far as they could get. They were really, really starting to have problems with their health. They were getting scurvy and they were losing control of their body. All things were happening to them. Shackleton got it first. He was really in trouble. As the journey continued to come back, the remaining dogs died. Shackleton actually collapsed with scurvy and had to be carried on the sledge. Here you can see him as they're pulling. This is a drawing that was made of it. Shackleton couldn't even walk. He was so ill. And the doctor, Dr. Wilson, who tried to diminish this, said that, yeah, we all have slight, though definite symptoms of scurvy. But they made it back to the boat, the ship, eventually on the 3rd of February. They had covered 960 miles, 93 days, about an average of 10 miles a day. Brutal travel. They were exhausted. They were sick. They didn't get to their pole. They got the new farthest south, but that was the first time anybody had ever done it. A relief ship, the Morning, had arrived, but with the Discovery still stuck in the ice, Scott decided he'd stay another year, and he wanted to get rid of Shackleton. Shackleton was a problem to him because the men loved Shackleton. Shackleton was a natural leader, and he just said, "Okay, I had to save you. You got sick. I'm the fellow that pulled you through." And even though others who were sick were allowed to stay, he sent Shackleton home. Well, that was actually a very good thing for Shackleton. Shackleton gets back to England, and he can do all kinds of stuff that makes him famous. He never forgave Scott for this, but it was actually a good thing for him. Scott chose to blame all his failures on Shackleton, portraying himself as the rescuer of a sick comrade. So Shackleton gets back to England. He's appointed as the head of the Royal Geographical Society of Scotland. He is able to start to talk to people about his own expedition and raising money. And this was a very good thing for him. So he gets a head start on that. Here is a wonderful picture of Shackleton in the middle, Amundsen on the left, and Perry on the right. Perry was the one who said he had gotten to the North Pole first. It's been well disputed that that really did not happen. Scurvy, let me talk a little bit about this. This is basically a lack of vitamin C. They didn't know much about vitamin C at the time. It didn't really get discovered until somewhere in the 1930s. But what happened was the small blood vessels would break, blood would be lost from the gums, loose teeth, joint pain, all kinds of problems. And back in Nelson's days, they didn't really understand this problem, but they knew that having some sort of a lemony juice would help. They didn't know what it was, but the doctors here, this guy Atkinson, said, no, this is a problem with the bacteria in the blood. And that was absolutely wrong. And it caused a lot of problems because they had really figured it out, even though they didn't know about vitamin C. It had been conquered back in Napoleon's time, 1747, when the Scottish physician Lind proved that one of the first controlled medical experiments, that citrus fruits were an effective cure for the disease. And you see, they were called limeys because they had lime juice, but really those were lemons. They weren't limes. They were bought from farmers in, of all places, Sicily, and its juice was drunk a little bit every day to give them a little bit of vitamin C. And of course, fresh vegetables, fresh meat, all of that has some form of vitamin C in it. So here we are later in the early 1900s, the surgeon somehow didn't know that and was putting out wrong information on scurvy. So what happened? What did they, why did they miss this? It was a mistake for that doctor to say that it was a bacterial infection. And here you can see lime or lemons being given to some sailors that had symptoms of scurvy. It was a Hungarian doctor in, I think it was 1932, that finally figured out the molecule was vitamin C, ascorbic acid. And from then on, scurvy has not been a problem. But stark examples of this rash of cases in infantile scurvy that affected the upper class back in the UK in the 19th century. Well, it was interesting because Louis Pasteur had figured out pasteurization of cow's milk to make it safer, but it was vastly safer, but all the vitamin C in the milk was destroyed. For the poorer children who tended to be breastfed and quickly weaned onto adult food, this was not an issue. But the wealthy fed their kids out of a bottle of cooked cereals and milk and were at grave risk. And of course, frostbite, always a problem. It nagged them constantly. Very, very painful. So, next, they get back. Shackleton has meetings with some fundraisers and puts together the British Imperial Antarctic Expedition using the ship Nimrod from 1907 to 1909. The objective of the journey was to reach the South Pole. Here is Mr. Shackleton with his wife, Emily, very dear lady. She was very supportive of Shackleton, although he was sort of a gadabout, let's put it that way. Another picture of them on the ship. So this apparently was said to have appeared in the paper. Men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in the event of success. This has been published a lot, but I really couldn't find any total proof, so I think it's probably apocryphal. It's somebody kind of made it up after the fact, but it's a cute story. Here's life aboard the Nimrod as they were going down. They had dogs, and they also had some horses. They tried that, some Siberian ponies. And the idea was he wanted to get somewhere along the south edge of the Great Ice Barrier and be able to march to the South Pole. He went back and forth. It was a horrible year for ice when he did it, and he ended up having to go back to Ross Island and set up a camp. Even though it was not near the original hut, Scott was very mad at him, said that you're invading my territory, and it was just a constant fight between Scott and Sir Ernest. They took a wheeled vehicle, motor-driven vehicle. They tried to figure out if they could pull the sledges with that. On that occasion, when they did the discovery, they had come within 480 miles of the pole, still a long way. But it would not be that easy for Shackleton on this trip. Here is Shackleton's hut. As you can see, pretty well snow covered with the drifting snow. Mount Erebus in the background, 10,000 feet above sea level. And they marched up there. They climbed up to that. Here's a view inside the hut, Shackleton's hut. Another one of these prefabricated huts. They burned coal. They burned seal and penguin blubber to keep warm. Here's the men sitting around the stove reading. Some of the original equipment all left. There's the horse bridles and things like that. Cans of food. This is exactly the way they left it. And the people from New Zealand come down several times during the summer period and do maintenance on the 3 sheds that are there. You can see there are cables holding the shed down because the winds can get furious here. And in this picture, you can see in the forefront, there's some dog kennels, and then there's a structure that's sort of dilapidated, but that was the stables for the horses that they had brought down. Here's a modern picture of it without the snow. Another view. You can see the horse stables this way. And the dog kennels. Horses were a problem. Dogs do all right in the cold and the snow. They only sweat from their tongue and a little piece of their pad on their foot. Horses are like humans. They sweat all over. Not a good animal to bring down to a very, very cold place. Here's a damage that occurred when one of the doors blew open and snow drifted in there. The snow was described by the word drift. This is what they would call it. It was so fine, like talc powder. It would get into everything. It would get under their clothes, up into their face, and just drive them crazy because it was so fine. Here they are doing some maintenance. And this a couple of years ago, these people from New Zealand had come down and they noticed that there was a problem with the floor. It had buckled, and they went to repair the floor. They picked up the old flooring, and much to their surprise, they found 4 unopened cases of single malt scotch that were brought down for the expedition. In very fine shape, had been well refrigerated. The bottles were stored in straw. You can see some ice in there with it. Well, they decided they would see what was happening. They took a couple of the bottles out, flew them back to New Zealand, to Christchurch. The distiller is still in business, Mr. McKinley, sent his distiller down in a private jet. They didn't open the bottles. They just took a hypodermic, sucked out some of the golden, beautiful liquid, and took it back to Scotland and tried to reproduce this. Now you can buy this reproduction of Shackleton's whiskey in the state store, and it's really very good if you're into single malt scotch. And this is a presentation bottle with maps and everything. It's really cool. So Cape Royds, 1908, they had done their bit putting out the food on these depots. Now they have to winter over. And they, of course, did the same thing. They had a little British Antarctic expedition, sort of like a book that they had put together for all the works that they had done. They decided they'd go up and explore Mount Erebus, the volcano. And here they are up at the top. And to give you an idea of some of the cliffs, on the picture on the right, you can see a fellow with a sledge down at the bottom. It gives you an idea of how high these ice cliffs were. Here's a first day cover commemorating their landing. The first motor car, a Errol Johnson from Scotland, a little British Scotch-made car that they thought would work to pull the sledges. It didn't work very well. It broke down a lot, so they ended up pulling everything by hand and with the horses and the dogs. This is the Beardmore Glacier that they had to climb from the ice shelf, which was at sea level. They had to climb up to 10,000 plus feet. And this was blue ice with many, many crevasses. It was brutal getting up this thing. And of course, because it's so dry and because it's so cold, they were dehydrated a lot. A map in the inset there of the Beardmore Glacier and another picture of it from an airplane. So on the 29th of October in 1908, they left on a fine day, they called it. They made this wonderful statement that only those who have experienced Antarctica directly can appreciate the feeling of exhilaration and excitement that setting out on a journey on a fine day in the Antarctic spring can give. Well, yeah, it was cold. They had these ponies that they offloaded off the ship. One of them fell in the water, and they tried to give it single malt whiskey to try to revive it. That's not what a horse wants. No, not good. So they didn't really know much about how to handle the horses or the dogs. Here they are loading up a sledge, being pulled by one of the ponies. Again, they depended on this pemmican, this fatty meat with lots of caloric progress, but no vitamins whatsoever. November 21st, the weakest ponies were shot, some of the meat eaten, which was good because it's fresh meat, and then the rest was depoted, put in a place where they could get it on the way back. On November 26th, they passed the previous farthest south that Scott had done in 1902, 82 degrees south. And you notice here in this picture, they had to build these snow walls every time they stopped to camp to protect the horses from the wind. They covered them. The horses would sweat, they would get sick, and they didn't have enough food for the horses, and it was just so much work. And more ponies were shot, and that freed up some of the food that the men began eating, the pony corn. Christmas celebrated again with some cigars, a little bit of creme de menthe, and a wonderful pudding, Christmas pudding. Shackleton was aware of the worsening situation, knowing that they only had a limited time in the light of their rations and physical state. They battled into the wind, into blizzards. Sometimes the blizzards kept them in their sleeping bags all day because it really wasn't that much of a blizzard, but the wind would kick up the snow and they couldn't see. The snow might have only been blown around to a depth of 15 or 20 feet, but that was enough to stop them from seeing. On the 27th of December, they had reached the polar plateau at an altitude of 10,200 feet, always into the wind, and I'll explain that. They were suffering from a lack of food, with hands and feet almost to the point of frostbite. Their clothing was not correct. They really didn't understand it. They didn't have hooded clothing. They used a balaclava. And remember, that drift would get up underneath anything and get them cold. So on January 9th, they reached their farthest south, 88 degrees, 23 minutes south, just less than 100 miles from the pole. They planted a flag, took some photographs, and beat it home. They almost got to the pole. On the journey back, the wind that they had been battling against was now behind them. So they rigged up a sail on the sledge and rushed across the ice, making almost 30 miles a day. And the reason for that is Antarctica, the plateau is high. It's a high pressure area. The air is always descending down over the pole, and it spreads out in every direction. So when you're headed toward the pole from anywhere, you're going to have a headwind. When you turn around and depart going the other way, you're going to have a tailwind. It took them a while to figure that out. They got some food from the depots that they had laid. They were actually in pretty good shape. Nobody was getting scurvy. They were well fed, contrasting to their walkout. They reached the hut point to find a note saying that the Nimrod was sheltering. They burned this little hut, a magnetic hut, to provide a smoke signal, and they came and got them and took them home. They had walked about 1,700 miles. Shackleton wrote a note to his wife saying, "I thought, dear, that you would rather have a live ass than a dead lion." He could have made it to the pole, but he didn't know if he could keep all his men alive. And that is Shackleton's main thing throughout his history, is all his men stay alive. He doesn't risk anybody. Here's another look, hanging up their socks in the hut. And this is a picture that Shackleton actually drew during that expedition of a penguin. So now we come to the third part, the race to the pole. This is between Amundsen and Scott, 1911. Amundsen was ostensibly supposed to be going to drift over the North Pole. He had the ship all prepared for that, but he only talked to one other person about any of his plans, and that was his brother. Nobody knew what he was going to do. He had actually had a hut built, prefabricated on the deck, along with lots of dogs. And even though he was planning to go over the North Pole, his mind changed when, remember, Mr. Peary said that he had done this. He had drifted over the pole. And Amundsen said at that moment, change of plans. Here he is with King Haakon on the Fram before departure, with Queen Maud standing around. The king is in the middle with the tall hat on, and that's Amundsen talking to him. Amundsen planned with very meticulous planning. He was very pragmatic. He did not leave things to happenstance. Amundsen had been immersed in plans, as I said, to go to the Arctic Ocean. And then when he received this news by Peary that already claimed the pole, he turned to the south. Amundsen reckoned that if he got to the South Pole, fame as well as financing of future explorations would be secure. Good picture of the crew on the Fram, with Amundsen in the round bowler hat in the middle. Now, just a little history of Mr. Amundsen. He was the first to actually ski in Antarctica back in the late 1800s. But in 1903, he was fascinated by the Englishman John Franklin's disastrous search for the Northwest Passage. And even though Franklin had two big ships with 129 men, Amundsen just took 6 men in a small boat and tried to find the remains of Franklin. And he actually took 3 years to do this. During the time he was searching, he did find them. He did find the remains. He lived with the Inuit. He learned their ways. He learned how they dressed. He learned how they ate. And he actually did the first Northwest Passage. It took him 3 years, but he got from one side to the other. A remarkable expedition. And this is just a map showing where he went looking for Franklin, and then also the Green Line moving out toward Alaska. 3 winters. So he learned a lot. Don't forget, this is a Norwegian who learned to ski before he could walk. So he understood skis, understood dogs. The dogs were not pets. They were workers. They were fellow workers. So he had a completely different mindset. So he said the Northwest Passage was done. It made him feel very, kind of teary-eyed when he thought of it, that he had done this. He was just something he had dreamed about all his life. Amundsen also spent some time with the northern people called the Sami people, who live with the reindeer up north above the Arctic Circle. And he learned their ways and how to dress and how to travel and eat. Here's a picture on the ship as they were sailing down south towards Antarctica. There's the crew, Amundsen with the flat-brimmed hat. Amundsen, all his men worked. Everybody did work. There was nobody that was above work. They all had things to do. Here is one of them sewing clothing, sewing some sails, different things like that. He was very, very fair-minded about everybody did the work. Same with Shackleton. One of the carpenters who worked throughout the winter was able to take 2/3 of the sledge's weight off without compromising the sledge by kind of just redesigning it and sanding it, shaving some wood off, which was very important for the weight. Here's some pictures, original pictures of the area where they would put the depots out and working with the dogs. You can see the clothing difference, completely different. Hooded clothing, fur seals, very warm compared to what the Brits had. The Brits were basically in very small insulated street clothes. Burberry's. Here is it over the winter, doing some studying of the maps, reading in the Fram, working with the dogs. He knew very well that Scott was headed for the pole as well. He wanted to get there first. He kind of pushed it. Now, September 12th is still very much winter down in Antarctica. And he tried to push the season. It was minus 52 C, minus 62 Fahrenheit. The dogs were affected by the cold. The men stiffened their frozen clothing. It was really bad. It was a stupid thing to do. And he really risked the people, his explorers, with him. And he had to rush back. He had to rush back because he had jumped the season. He started before the arrival of springtime and manageable weather. The result was some valuable dogs were lost, frostbite on the feet, which would require a month to heal. He raced back to the ship. He abandoned two of his companions, skied ahead of them, struggled into camp, and after his return, one of his best expedition men, Halmar Johansson, was very mad at him, and he called it a panic. It's not an expedition, it's a panic. And boy, those words did not sit well with Amundsen, and poor Johansson was not let to go to the pole. Kind of vicious, I thought. They had planned well. Their arrangements were good. They had an 800-mile journey, more than 800 miles on October 20th. He took off across the ice. He was actually about 100 miles closer to the pole than Scott because of where he put his ship on the ice shelf. Each one of the sledges weighed 880 pounds, pulled by 13 dogs. So for the most part, they understood how to work the dogs. They understood skiing, and they didn't work very hard. Sometimes they would just sit on the sledge and let the dogs pull them. It was really a different operation completely. They did not believe in man-hauling. The dogs were there for the work. They got up unexplored land. They got into some crevasses. They had to be very careful. But when they got to the polar plateau, over what we call the Queen Maud Range, into the polar plateau, they got there without any major mishap, and they reached their goal on schedule. So on December 14th, 1911, they planted the flag at the geographic South Pole. They had to take some time to do readings back and forth to make sure it was the exact center. They named it King Haakon the Seventh Plateau, and they did not waste a lot of time. They turned around and went for home. They left a note. Amundsen left a note for Scott, written ostensibly to show that he had been there. It was a very nice, a special way. With a few words, he was able to ensure that Scott would take care of this letter and prove his success. It was an elegant way of telling Scott that he won. Here's some pictures of them doing some readings, and you can see the plate, the glass plate was cracked. When it's photoshopped, you can see we can get out some of the lines and then colorize it. Makes it very pretty. On the return leg, they left some of the surplus stores in their tent, which Scott would really need. And throughout the journey, dogs were shot on the way back. The dogs were fed to the people and to the other dogs. So they were not a problem with scurvy at all. They arrived back in their base on January 29th. And Amundsen walked into the tent and said to his cook, Lindstrom, "Do you have any coffee for us?" That's how effortless it was. They were back. "Sure, I have coffee for you, sir." Now we have the story of Scott. Same expedition, same time. They get there, 1910. They put out the depots. They do all of this work. They had a souvenir that they had made. They had photographer with them, all of these things. But his chronicler, who chronicled the whole expedition, ended up calling Scott's first-rate tragedy. Here's his wife, Kathleen, and Scott looking at some Mongolian ponies back in the UK before they came down. Some of the archives, his compass, and a few other things that Scott had. Here's a picture that was taken on the left and a painting that was made of the same scene. Life aboard with the ponies. The ponies got seasick right away. It was really bad, really hard for the ponies. Here, Captain Oates was basically put in charge of the ponies. He loved that he was an Army captain, and that was he was a leader. He was able to take care of the horses as best he could, even though they got shaky legs and seasickness all the time. Here is a picture in the cabin, Scott in the middle. You might notice if you go on the left side, the third guy in, that's Apsley Cherry Gerard. He was the chronicler. He was also the one that did the worst journey in the world. And if you go to the right side, the fourth guy in with the large nose is Bertie Bowers. Here's that same scene, what it looks like today. Scenes around the ship. There's in the lower right is the chronicler doing the polar magazine that they did and also chronicling what happened. Here they are doing some surveying. Scott at the top, that's what it looks like today. That's what it looked like when he was there on the bottom. And you might be able to make out in that lower left picture, Heinz beans, baked beans. And the cook over on the lower right. 365 ways to make penguin. Here they are dividing up the food for their polar exploration. Again, they used this pemmican and this heavy stuff. So they had various other things. They had tea, cocoa, things like that. They had a pinola or player piano. They would do little plays and keep themselves busy over the winter months. Here is actually one of Scott's pocket diaries. Here they are doing some exercise. That's Captain or Dr. Wilson with one of the ponies. And this is Captain Oates with another. Here's the shed, the hut as we call it. Here they are practicing pulling. That's Scott in the front on the left, and that's Bertie Bowers on the right. And you can see the sledge is quite large. Here they're abusing the dog. I don't know what they're doing. Who let the dogs out? And you can see after being outside for some time, the picture on the left, what would happen. And again, they did not have hoods. These were balaclavas, and that dusty snow would get into everything. So in the middle of the dead of winter, these three people, on the left, Bertie Bowers, in the middle, Dr. Wilson, and on the right, Apsley Cherry Gerard, made this phenomenal voyage over to the other side of Ross Island to get these penguin eggs. They almost died in this 70-mile trek. It was brutal. They lost their tent. So many things happened to them. It was unbelievable. Here's what they looked like when they got back. They were just about dead. They had all kinds of problems. And the eggs that they brought back from this wonderful expedition, nothing was ever done with them. Shame. Bertie Bowers with one of the horses. They had a tractor that they had brought down, figuring, well, maybe this will pull the sledges. It didn't work. It was constantly broken. Couldn't get it to work. It was so cold and so dry there, the fuel would freeze. So they abandoned the sledges. They started pulling by hand. The weather deteriorated in early December with large snows, which is very rare because it's really a desert. When it snows, the snow stays forever. But they had some heavy snows, and it made the travel extremely difficult for man and beast. Scott and his men set out with 10 ponies and a team of dogs on November 1st, 1911. Remember, it was just a month later that Amundsen got there in December. They had difficulties. The horses were also suffering from snow blindness. They made these hoods for the horses to help them. They had to build these pony walls all the time. It was a lot of work. The ponies were getting more and more ill, decrepit. and they were not getting this warmer weather that they had hoped for. Here they are pulling the sledges. Great picture there showing the pony wall and trying to set up their tent. The last of the ponies was shot before they even got up to the Beardmore Glacier. From now on, there were just 12 men headed for the polar plateau, pulling their sledges. Teams of 4, 3 teams of 4. Here's again the Beardmore, very vicious place, blue ice, lots of crevasses, and high altitude. They get up to the top. They're up at 10,000 feet. The air is thin, so they're really having problems breathing. Now they have to cross the polar plateau. The last day of December, 2 of the remaining sledge teams neared 87 South, which was celebrated with extra rations. They had still more than 300 miles to go, and you can look at this. This is what it looked like. Endless, flat, nothing to look at. On the 31st of December, just before 86 degrees, 56, almost 87 South, Evans turned back with Crean, and Bowers took this photograph. So now they were just going to be a team of 4 left for the pole. But Scott changed that. He, with 180 miles to go, he sent back that team, the supporting party, with 3 men rather than 4. He decided to bring Bertie Bowers for a team of 5 to go to the pole. So that changed a lot. That changed the food allocation. The guys going back had to work harder because there's only 3 of them, and it caused a lot of problems. They were always short of supplies. The fuel was a problem. The fuel was in containers that were not sealed. They had covers or screw tops on them, but at the high altitude and the cold temperatures, the fuel vaporized. So when they opened up a full can of fuel, they found that half of it was gone already. So that caused problems. They were running out of fuel. On the 16th of January, Bowers saw something strange on the horizon, a black flag. And together with the ski marks and dog tracks, it told the story that they had come in second. The Norwegians triumphed. Scott reluctantly accepts second place. They took some readings to make sure that they had actually gotten to the pole, and they started back. They were 5 of them. They were in bad shape. They were cold. They were running out of food. They were able to take the letter for the King of Norway and whatever supplies, the discarded supplies, and off they went to head back to try to make it home. Life inside the tent, constantly a problem. Cold. Their clothing, when they took it off to get in their sleeping bags, the clothing would freeze. It was very hard to get back on. It took them sometimes an hour or 2 to get to get the clothing back on because it was so cold and wrinkled. They reached one of their major depots on the 25th of January and were able to replenish their supplies, but there was no fresh meat. They were starting to get scurvy. It had been weeks since they consumed pony meat. Injuries plagued the crew. Evans, Petty Officer Evans, cut his finger and it wouldn't heal. And he was in bad shape from frostbite. And he ended up dying from his wounds, painful injuries caused by this man hauling. Now there were just 4 of them pulling the sledge. Evans dies. Late February, the night temperatures had dropped to minus 40, which made it unbelievable. Minus 40 is the same centigrade in Fahrenheit. Their boots and clothing took forever to get on each morning. Nothing dried out. The wet items just turned into polygons of frozen leather and fabric. Oates, who was getting very ill, knew that he was basically a drag, and his famous quote, he said, "I'm going outside and maybe sometime." He was never seen again. So now it's just the 3 of them. Bowers, Wilson, and Scott. They were only a few miles from a 1-ton depot of food, but they never left the tent because the weather was so bad that they just couldn't navigate. The snow drifting, blowing, made the visibility really bad, and they couldn't find their marks. Scott wrote many letters at this time, telling that it was not faulty organization. In fact, that he said that the older people did better than the younger people. He was trying to cover his miscalculations. He said, had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the hearts of every Englishman. He wrote back asking this rich country to take care of the dependent people that he was leaving behind. They couldn't go further. They were running out of everything. They were waiting for the weather to break, and their food and fuel grew less each day. Less than 12 miles from this one-ton depot, but they couldn't make it. There was even a chance when they thought Wilson and Bertie Bowers would try to go and get some of the food and bring it back, but they couldn't do it either. Wilson had given some opium pills distributed earlier, so they could at least not die in pain. And Scott wrote his last diary entry, I do not think we can hope for any better thing now. And his last entry was, for God's sake, look after our people. They died in their tent. Nobody knows the exact date. The next spring, the group came out to find them. They found the tent. It was pretty much covered. Everybody was frozen solid, perfectly preserved in there. So they got all the records and they left them there, collapsed the tent and just put it down. So the news of Scott's death did not reach Britain until the following year or so. But when the news came to Christchurch, New Zealand, Amundsen was there, and he heard that Scott had died. He turned to his crew and he said, Scott won. He was going to be the hero, the tragic hero. And in fact, it turned into that, the native son into tragic hero. King George V attended the funeral. That never happens, that a monarch would go to a funeral of a commoner. It was the beginning of Scott's elevation to the status of tragic hero. And the contrast between what Apsley Cherry Gerard, the chronicler, called a business-like operation of Amundsen and Scott's first-rate tragedy is really painful to draw. But if you go into the details, you can see Amundsen used dogs, Scott ponies, and a motor sledge. Didn't work. Amundsen traveled by ski, something he knew how to do. Scott never learned to ski, and his men trudged pulling their own sledges. Amundsen depoted 3 times the supplies Scott did. Scott starved and suffered scurvy. Amundsen took 5 men and 3 tons of supplies and 52 huskies to the pole. Scott took 1 ton of supplies and 17 men. This lack of fuel that I explained before, Amundsen knew about this. He knew about this creep where the fuel would evaporate. So he solder sealed all his fuel tins. So he had no problem with the fuel. Scott did not know about that. The clothing was different. The Burberry clothing on the left that the Brits wore was really inadequate for what they were facing. On the right, you can see the skins, animal skins, that were much better insulating. Well, Scott said, yeah, Shackleton brought horses and he had almost made it to the pole. So you can understand that he had that idea, but it didn't work. The ponies were just a drag. And the depot laying, the Brits didn't lay as many depots and they weren't as careful with marking them. The Norwegians marked it unbelievably. They knew that there could be a problem with the drifting snow. So they went out miles in each direction with little black flags and markers. So if they missed a marker, they could go in and they knew which side the markers were on, left or right. You can see it in this picture here. So they could locate their depot. A lot of work done. For one distance where Amundsen laid 7 depots, Scott only laid 2. And that was a big difference. It was hard to find. It wasn't that the weather was that bad. It was that they couldn't see their tracks or their markings. And Scott's team did not travel on those days because of this problem that they couldn't find their marks. They couldn't find their tracks. Maybe if they had done better depoting, they could have found it. and might have survived. Again, a picture of the two different tracks, Scott on the left in green and Amundsen on the red side. So the race to the pole is over. On next Monday, we'll talk about the trans-Antarctic expedition of Ernest Shackleton. It's a story that is unbelievable in endurance. It's probably the greatest adventure story ever. And I hope you'll join me for that. And I thank you for being here and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.